Yeah, sounds good. It works for me. So, yeah, like you, I'm also kind of an ANCAP. I kind of tend with anarchist principles. And I think around 2021, I think your channel was kind of taking off a little, and I remember seeing a lot of videos like on privatizing police force and things like that. I mean, I have some qualms with like capitalism in general, but overall, the theme of freedom and liberty was been on my mind. And then I've been apolitical for a couple of years until this conflict came about, Israel, Hamas, Gaza.
Okay, you're
For me-
specifically referring to the October 7th attack that has since spawned a lot of discussion.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't know much about it until October 7th either, like most of the world. But it did revive my interest in, I guess, political philosophy and all of that. So, my news is also kind of one-sided. So the reason I wanted to have this debate and discussion was, what is the other side? I mean, I do see the other side sometimes, but I just see like APAC-funded politicians just with their really obvious lies, and they're not really coherent, and they clearly look bribed, in my opinion. So I wanted to discuss with someone who, is kind of pro-Israel, and I did see your posts. It was usually pro-Israel. So if you want to get started with your opening statement and just kind of educate me on like your end of how you view this conflict and whether you think Islam is the biggest motivator for Palestinians or if it's something else. So
Okay.
yeah.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to have this discussion. And I want to state first, yes, I am an anarcho-capitalist. And for that reason, some people say, isn't it a little odd then that you come down on a more pro-Israel side? And to clarify, what I'm going to say is this. I am against all forms of government. And in that respect, I have many, many criticisms of the government of Israel. However, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is more than simply a political and geographical conflict, in my opinion. It is, and it really comes down more about the right of Jewish people to exist anywhere in the world at all. At least that's my opinion. Having studied, this is a topic I have studied since before October 7th. And although I don't claim to be an expert, I have read numerous books on the subject. I've done my best to try and listen to the best arguments on both sides. And it is my opinion, again, I could be wrong, and I'm open to debating it, but it is my opinion that, save for those that are not very informed and have only heard sound bites, anyone who has truly researched this issue, it is my opinion, you will come to the conclusion that Islam is in fact the primary motivator for Middle Eastern or Arab opposition to Israel, and that almost everyone who is it is, again, I can't say paint with too broad a brush, but I think many of the political commentators and those in the West that take a very anti-Israel stance, it really comes down to deeply ingrained anti-Semitic beliefs and hatred of Jews. At least that's my opinion. And I know there's a lot we could get into, so I wrote an opening statement here that I'm just going to read in order to try and keep myself from getting too long-winded. So without further ado, here's what I've written. I have included academic citations that I can reference if you want me to, if you specifically want to draw in on any particular count afterwards. So beginning, here's my opening statement. The current Israel-Palestine conflict is centuries old, but at the heart of this conflict is Islamic beliefs about the Jews and the role of government. To properly frame and understand this conflict, it is important to understand the following historical facts. More than 3,000 years ago, the Israelites entered the Levant and founded the nation of Israel, first as a tribal confederation and later as a monarchy. The kingdom later split into two separate nations, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Although the land would go on to be conquered by multiple different empires in the millennia that followed, no other independent nation ever existed in that region since that time, and Jews have maintained a constant and uninterrupted presence in the land throughout that time, even if only as a minority. During its time as a territory of the Roman Empire, the land took on the name Judea, or Land of the Jews. The term Palestine was not introduced to the region until the 2nd century AD. Following a failed Jewish rebellion against Rome in 132 AD, Rome exiled large numbers of Jews from the region and renamed the area Syria Palestina as an insult to the Jews, the term itself being a reference to the Jews' ancient enemies, the Philistines, who had lived in the area that now constitutes the Gaza Strip centuries earlier. Consequently, Palestine was used to refer to a geographical region, but not to a people or a nation. It is similar to how we would use the term Appalachia or the Rockies in the United States. Both terms refer to geographical regions, but not to actual independent nations or national identities. There is no evidence of Arabs in the region until the Muslim conquest of the 7th century. For all the talk of Israel being a, quote, settler colonialist state today, it should be noted that Arab Muslims originally came to the region as conquering invaders. In the centuries that followed, the local population was displaced, replaced, conquered, and changed over more times than can be counted as a result of the Crusades and other wars. Nevertheless, small communities of Jews remained in the land, and Jewish communities throughout the world regularly uttered prayers for return to Eretz Israel, as they called it. By the 1800s and early 1900s, the land was part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Multiple historians and other famous individuals, to include famed author Mark Twain, visited the land during this time period, and not one of them ever mentioned encountering a group of people called the Palestinians. During this time, visitors recorded the presence of roughly 3 different groups of people: Muslim Arabs, smaller groups of Christian Arabs, and of course, Jews. However, of these 3 groups, the only group that was reported to have had deep historical ties and affection for the land were the Jewish communities. Palestine during this time period was noted by all to be desolate and largely depopulated. It was not a place that anyone wanted to live, save for Jewish immigrants who came because of their deep historical and religious ties to the land. And here's a quote from Sir John William Dawson, who visited the land of Palestine in 1888. He said, quote, "No nation has been able to establish itself as a nation in Palestine up to this day. No national union and no national spirit has prevailed there. The motley impoverished tribes which have occupied it have held it as mere tenants at will, temporary landowners, evidently waiting for those entitled to permanent possession of the soil," end quote. Following World War I, Palestine came under British rule. Under the leadership of the British, Jewish immigration to the land was tightly controlled, but Arab immigration was largely unregulated. Per the findings of the Peel Commission in 1939, Jewish immigrants to Palestine purchased their land at higher prices than can be considered reasonable, going out of their way to purchase uncultivated land first before purchasing any land that had already been cultivated or inhabited by Arabs. As economic opportunities, overwhelmingly created by Jews, began to improve the conditions of British Mandate Palestine, hundreds of thousands of Arabs from Egypt, Transjordan, and Syria, who were no more recent to the land than the Jewish immigrants, suddenly began flooding into the area in order to take advantage of the economic opportunities, again, opportunities that were overwhelmingly created by Jewish immigrants. It is important to note that many of the people who today call themselves Palestinians are in fact descended from these Arab immigrants who came to the area at the exact same time many of the early Zionists did. What the British didn't understand is that Islam teaches that Jews are the greatest enemies of the Muslims and that Jews can only be tolerated in Islamic lands so long as they are subservient to an Islamic government. In surahs 2, 5, and 7 of the Quran, Jews are referred to as apes and pigs and, quote, the worst of living creatures in the sight of Allah. In the Hadith, which are oral and written traditions about the history of Islam, it is stated that the end of the world will not come until the Muslims fight and kill the Jews entirely. Incidentally, this Hadith is quoted in the Hamas Covenant and is frequently cited by the Palestinian Authority in internal communications to its people. It is no surprise then that by the 1920s, Arab terrorism against Jews in British Mandatory Palestine became commonplace. Though the British frequently sought to appease the Arabs, proposing smaller and smaller sections of the mandate to be set aside for a Jewish state, while giving all that remained to the Arabs remained unmoved. They would not accept anything aside from an Arab majority state in the entire mandate, which would inevitably have resulted in a Muslim government under which Jews would have been relegated to second-class status under Islamic law, and frequently subjected to pogroms and other discrimination, as they had been throughout the history of the Ottoman Empire. On May 14, 1948, Israel formally declared its independence, and though it was clear that it was to be a Jewish state, it appealed to Arabs in the region for peace, promising full and equal citizenship to all who cooperated. Immediately, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon declared war on the fledgling Jewish state. Muslim volunteers from other countries, including Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Pakistan, traveled to join this fight. It is important to note that, while Muslim, not all these volunteers were Arabs. All levels of Arab leadership made clear that this was primarily an Islamic jihad, not merely a dispute about territory, and thus it was the moral obligation of all Muslims to fight the Jews. For example, Sheikh Mohammed Mohawafi, the Mufti of Egypt, declared that Jews were working to, quote, take over all the lands of Islam, and thus jihad against the Jews in Palestine was incumbent on all Muslims. Abd al-Rahman Azam Pasha, the Secretary General of the Arab League, stated, with regards to his intentions for this war, it will be a war of annihilation. It will be a momentous massacre in history that will be talked about like massacres of the Mongols or the Crusades. In the nearly 80 years that have followed Israel's surprising victory in 1948, multiple peace negotiations have taken place, and the Palestinians have been offered their own state on no less than 3 occasions. Most recently, in 2008, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered the Palestinians sovereignty in nearly 100% of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and some additional territory, as well as offering Israeli citizenship to 150,000 of the so-called Palestinian refugees. These offers have been universally rejected by the Palestinians and instead responded to with terrorism. On the few occasions that the Palestinians have signed treaties with Israel, Palestinian leaders such as Yasser Arafat have referenced Muhammad's Treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah, a signal to Muslims that peace negotiations are merely tactical measures to buy time and not any genuine effort to seek permanent peace with the Israelis. Well, I think that this historical framework provides ample evidence that Islam is the primary obstacle to peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think the most powerful fact that demonstrates this is the state of what we today call the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, although more accurately referred to as the historic territories of Judea and Samaria, from the years 1948 to 1967. Today, it is taken for granted by most in public discourse that these territories, known as the West Bank and Gaza Strip, are historic Palestinian territories, and that Israel has illegally occupied both regions since the Six-Day War in 1967. However, what most have forgotten is that prior to the Six-Day War, the West Bank was sovereign Jordanian territory, and the Gaza Strip was sovereign Egyptian territory. From 1948 to 1967, none of the people who today identify as Palestinians offered one public outcry about how Egypt and Jordan were illegally occupying their lands. This is especially significant in Gaza, since Egyptian treatment of Palestinians in Gaza was notably poor, Saudi Arabian radio having compared it to Hitler's concentration camps. The fact that there was no opposition to Jordanian and Egyptian control of what Palestinians today insist is their historic homeland proves conclusively that this conflict is not merely a territorial dispute, but a religious one. The so-called Palestinian people would happily accept occupation from any nation so long as it is an Arab Muslim nation. But because of their religious hatred of Jews, they cannot accept the existence of a Jewish state, no matter how small. Textbooks created by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, known as UNRWA, instruct Palestinian children in the previously mentioned Islamic anti-Semitism and encourage them throughout their lives to hate Israel and engage in terrorism. For this reason, peace negotiations aimed at a lasting peace and a two-state solution are doomed to fail. The problem cannot be solved, it can only be managed, primarily by Israelis taking appropriate security measures that include hunting down and destroying terrorist organizations committed to their destruction. And that is my opening statement.
All right, thank you. So I'll begin with what I have researched and what I know on my end. And I don't think mine is as lengthy as yours, but we shall start. Basically, if you look at this conflict from a secular standpoint, which is what I'm basically like atheist, so religion itself is a hard concept for me to understand and understand how significant it could be. However, if you look at it from a colonial perspective, right? So we have during the 1940s, a lot of the world was colonized by Britain and France, right? So we have from Africa to India to Latin America, etc. When you have,
let me quickly state I would agree, but I think it is important to note that the colonization of the Middle East resulted primarily from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. And so areas like British Mandate Palestine, yes, that came under British rule, but that was at least in part because of the Arabs siding with the British during World War I in exchange for their help in overthrowing the Turks. So yes, that's true, but I think that is important context.
Yeah, so World War One, it was like 1914, 1919. So around 1940, we could still say like it was still under British colonization. And I'd go as far as to say like the Arabs, even though like they may have sided with, they would have got British help, during the war. I still think during that time they would not have wanted to be colonized by the British. They were still protesting against British occupation and colonization. And there's also ample evidence that the British and I mean the Muslims and the Jews in the area, they both had a common enemy that was the British. However, what the British have done throughout all of history is to play divide and conquer. They did this in India with the Hindus and Muslims there, right? And I think for the West, Islamophobia is a very powerful weapon to get what they want. In general, we can see how as long as you continue to demonize a group of people as barbaric, they're just killing for Islam. They're just killing for, and yeah, I mean, I'm atheist. I hate all religions. Oh, well, not hate, but I don't believe any religion. And so many of these holy scriptures, in my opinion, they all have like extremist rhetoric, including the Bible, including Quran, including the Torah or the Bhagavad Gita or whatever. But that doesn't mean that like the average person that follows that religion, you know, follows it literally. So based off of that, we can quote the Quran's scriptures, but that doesn't mean everyone, the average Muslim actually believes that, and that's what they want to do. And I think I went off on a tangent here, but yeah, we can see that like the Islamophobia in general, the West has propagated a lot, and they benefit from it a lot. We can let's just look at some other conflict in the Middle East just for parallels, right? You can look at the invasion of Iraq, which was a complete lie, which is a lie that they had weapons of mass destruction. But why were people able to believe it, and why did they believe that Saddam Hussein was such a threat? They believe he was such a threat because the media has used its power to show that Muslims are such barbaric and like they cannot be trusted with these weapons. And if they have a weapon, then that is the end for all of humanity or the world. And then they went in, they destroyed Iraq, and for like who knows what reason. And we also kind of know how much the U.S. interventionism in the Middle East is due to oil and resources and just overall like neocolonialism. And again, if an empire wants resources, their best bet is to demonize a group of people, and then it makes it easier to justify to their own population why they're doing that. So once we come up with the eye that like, look, the West can lie, the West does use dehumanizing tactics, and it can benefit them, we can then turn back to the Israel-Palestine conflict and be like, okay, we have, I think Jews were like 15% of the population, before Zionists started coming. You have Theodore Herzl, like the founder of Zionism, sending a letter to the British saying, we want to start a colonization project in what is Palestine right now, in modern day, Israel. He literally sent a letter saying, we want to colonize the place. We have the first prime minister of Israel saying, we want to expel the Arabs from the land. And when you have Jews...
When you say we want to expel Arabs, if you're referring to Ben Gurion, do you have a direct quote on that? Which quote are you referring to?
I do, actually. I can look it up. Ben Gurion, we need to expel the Arabs from the region. I think this was around when Israel gained its independence. Yeah.
Because it is important to note the context in which that was stated, because Ben Gurion, is my opinion, I don't believe Ben Gurion was necessarily a good person. Heck, he was a socialist. However, okay. I think many of his quotes are abused in many ways, in that it's stated that from the start, the plan was to come in here guns blazing and kick the Arabs out. That's not something that I believe can be substantiated. I think as you get closer to the war, and bear in mind, it didn't begin in 1948, but after being aware of the fact that the Arabs were hostile to the Jewish state, I think many quotes from Ben Gurion more or less came to understand this was going to end in bloodshed one way or another, and he's more or less stating that. That's not stating that it was their plan from the start to forcibly expel all Arabs. Bear in mind, you say the proportion of the land was like 8 to 15% Jews in the late 1800s. But I think what many people forget is, one, The land was barren and largely depopulated. And again, we've got multiple expeditions that were sent to Palestine during that region that confirm just that. No one wanted to live there. It was largely desolate, and there was plenty of room for people to move in. And further, the Arabs who lived in the region had absolutely no sense that they were "quote unquote" Palestinians. There was no idea that there was such identity. There were Arab Muslims, small groups of Arab Muslims. There were small groups of Arab Christians, and all who visited the region during that time said they had no special connection to the land or no sense of national identity. So when you say Theodor Herzl planned to come and expel this other people, this other nation, that's really not the appropriate way to put it either. He wanted to start Jewish state in a land that was known to be the historic Jewish homeland, and in which, although there were other residents, there was no deep connection to the land or sense of national identity.
Yeah. So on that front, I mean, it's very subjective, and I don't think it's easy to objectively prove like if people had a "quote unquote" deep connection to the land. What we can objectively see is that like Jews were a minority, the majority were Muslim, and we can go really far back and be like, the Arabs colonized the place, and yeah, that was atrocious as well. And I know the crimes of the Arab leaders, Muslim leaders, in conquering the land, the crimes of the Ottoman Empire, etc. However, what we can agree is that like there was a minority Jew in the late 1800s. We have the Zionist movement ramping up in Europe due to anti-Semitism. We have a lot of Zionist leaders, not just Theodor Herzl, but we also have Vladimir Jabotinsky, who says and this was in 1923. This is when the world was, under mostly colonization by Europe. He said that every native population in the world resists colonists as long as they see any hope of ridding themselves of danger of foreign settlement. Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed, regardless of the native population. This can only continue and develop under the shield of force, which is not dependent on the local population, behind an iron wall which they cannot reach. So he's basically saying, like, we gotta colonize them and we have to use force. Like, you can't just peacefully kind of go in there. And this was a famous Zionist leader, bro.
I know, but again, I would say that's you have to understand the context under which this takes place. Jews have just endured thousands of years of pogroms all throughout Europe. Not quite to the same extent in the Ottoman Empire, but still many pogroms in the Ottoman Empire as well. Is he saying we're going to go in and force them out, or is he accurately predicting, as I think happened, anti-Semitism is a huge problem worldwide, and the Jews have tried to deal with it for thousands of years? Look, I can accurately predict when we try to found our own state, there is going to be bloodshed, and we have to be prepared to defend ourselves. That's how I personally interpret those quotes, given what happened. And again, especially the fact, I can read another quote here, some from the Peel Commission, some prior, but there's more than enough evidence that prior to in the late 1800s, early 1900s, what became the British Mandate of Palestine was desolate and largely depopulated. It's not like there was this thriving community of Arabs who just loved the land and weren't ready to give it up. It was a crappy place that no one wanted to live. As the Jews came in, they purchased largely uncultivated, swampy, cheap, and most importantly, land without tenants. In fact, I've got a quote here. 1920, labor Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion expressed his concern about the Arab fellahin, which he viewed as those were the poor farmers that were there prior to many other Arab immigrants, the most important asset of the native population. He said, quote, under no circumstances must we touch land belonging to the fellahs or work by him. Instead, he advocated helping liberate them from their oppressors, who were at that time the Turks. And he said, only if a fellah, which is an Arab who already has a farm there, leaves his place of settlement should we offer to buy his land at an appropriate price. Like, there's no talk of we're going to come in and kill all these people and kick them off their land. They started buying land that was swampy, decultivated, and they cultivated it and created economic opportunity, which again caused hundreds of thousands of Arabs from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, other regions in the early 1900s to flood into the region, wanting to take advantage of economic opportunity that was overwhelmingly created by Jews. So as large as the population of Arabs was by 1948, people forget I mean, it's difficult to calculate exactly what the percentage was, but at the very least, at least 1/4 of the Arabs who were living there at the time were no more recent to the land than the Jews, and if not half or more of them, given the fact that prior to that time, it wasn't exactly a place people were wanting to live, save for the Jews who wanted to come there for personal and religious reasons and to escape persecution.
Yeah. So on that note, right, like, obviously there was like rampant anti-Semitism in Europe, and we know that. But many historians, and again, you used a lot of subjective terms too, so I'm gonna kind of use it too. But many historians agree that there was relative peace amongst Muslims, Christians, and Jews during the Ottoman Empire. Now, of course, there's going to be like, you can find one or two instances of like persecution.
I mean, I hate to interrupt, but we're not talking one or two. You can find dozens of instances of pogroms that take place going all the way back to the 1400s. I mean, we're not talking, when you say many historians say there was relative peace between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, the important context there. Relative peace, that means that Christians and Jews were second-class citizens under Islamic law. They were protected, considered dhimmis, protected persons, but they did not have equal rights to Muslims. And again, when you consider the breadth of statements in the Quran about the Jews being apes and pigs and the greatest enemies of Allah, these are not isolated incidents. There are dozens of I dare to. I'm not going to go so confidently to say hundreds, but off the top of my head, I can already think of at least a dozen pogroms that took place throughout the Ottoman Empire that were specifically targeted against Jews, again, primarily for the Islamic reasons that are stated in the Quran and the Hadith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like so there's 2 points there to make. I'll touch on the scripture part, right?
First, actually, let me just, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but are you denying that when historians say there was relative peace between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, are you denying the fact that this so-called peace was only peaceful in virtue of the fact Christians and Jews were dhimmis under Islamic law? They were allowed to live and practice their religion, but there were special restrictions that took place against them because they were non-Muslims. They were not equal citizens under the law. Are you denying that?
Oh, sure. I mean, yeah, like I agree. But we can't look at certain historical events with a modern equality and secular lens, right? Like, a lot of things have changed in terms of, we abolished slavery, we got women's rights, and things were just different back then. So we can't necessarily judge the Ottoman Empire purely from a modern lens. We have to judge it based on, at that time, how other countries have treated their groups. And in other countries, Jews were treated even worse. And that's where historians say there was relative peace, because Jews were at least allowed to practice their faith without like completely just being, murdered, scapegoated, and things like that. So yeah, of course there was discrimination. There was a lot of, worse for women's rights back then, worse for even darker skinned people back then. And things are improving now. So like, everything has to be taken from that historical perspective. So, I mean, I agree. I'm not going to defend like some Islamic theocratic regimes ever. Like, that's not what I do as an anarchist. So that's my point on like that, why historians say there was relative peace is, it proves that like the Muslims aren't just out to to kill Jews for no reason. And if you want to quote the Quran, like, as an atheist, none of the scriptures really mean anything to me, but I do see a lot of anti-Semitic people also quoting like the Talmud of the Jews, and saying things like, "Oh, it's okay for Jews to rape a 9-year-old non-Jew and get away with it." Like, I don't know. Look, obviously the context of it's probably wrong, but the point is, like, if we dig into scripture here, we can dig into scripture there. And
okay, well, and I would just want to point out, you're right, and I don't really want to debate the Talmud here or how different it is. What I can say is, for all the people who quote the Talmud claiming that it gives Jews permission to enslave non-Jews, there are 0 Jewish empires in history that conquered and enslaved Muslim nations. There are at least 7 Muslim empires in history that conquered and enslaved Jewish and Christian communities, and at least 23 modern Muslim states today that actively discriminate against non-Muslims. So I don't think it's comparable, in as much as we have again, dozens of historical examples of Muslim nations actively discriminating against Jews. And although you may say, well, they weren't just trying to kill Jews because they were Jews. True, they were willing to tolerate Jews as second-class citizens under Islamic law, as effectively slaves to the Islamic regime that were given certain protected status provided they stayed in line. But Muslims were not about to accept an independent community of Jews that were living apart from Muslim rule. That's what's critical to understand if you understand the history of the region, is that they were only willing to tolerate Jews as dhimmis, as second-class citizens ruled by an Islamic government.
Mm. Okay. So yeah, like, so look, I guess we both agree on like the scripture part, right? Like, I guess I'm not a theologian, you're not a theologian, but we know that like, even for the Bible or whatever, you're a Christian, right? If I understood your tweets properly, maybe.
Yes, I am a Christian. That's correct.
Okay, got it. So yeah, and I don't want to fit anyone's belief, but there's always things we can find in scripture, but we have to see how they're being applied, in today's logic. And of course, I'm not going to defend any of the other Islamic, theocratic nations that exist today. And this is a false dichotomy some people do. Is if I defend Palestinian rights, it's as if I'm defending all Islamic theocratic nations, or that it's an Arab v. Jew conflict, where for me, I look at it as Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a conflict between two nationalities, not two races. So in that perspective, right, like, of course, Iran commits war crimes, Assad commits war crimes, we know this, and I condemn that. The reason Israel gets...
All right, I'm sorry, go ahead and finish.
Yeah. The reason Israel gets a lot of attention is because they claim to be a secular democracy. They get support from the U.S. and hence they're held to a higher standard. And if you look at so once I remove religion from it and I look at what Palestinians have endured since 1948 up to now, any reasonable person would be like, oh, they are fighting against colonial oppression. And now another reason it gets a lot of attention now is most of the world, from Africa, Latin America to India, all suffered colonization. It's in their memories. We have people still alive from colonization. So when they see what's happening to the Palestinians from white, supposed white colonizers, for them it stings them. It's really relatable. It's like, this is exactly what they did to us. They dehumanized us. They created settlements. They made military checkpoints. And I know taxing isn't really applicable in the Gaza Strip, but they tax us, or they use financial blockades. A lot of the tactics that they're using, and the fact that they come from white people as well. And I know I'm not. You're supposed to be race blind, but that's not the way a lot of the world sees it. Obviously, for them, it's like European colonization. It's one part of European colonization that's still around today. Most of the world got its freedom, but Israel still lingers, and so. Objectively,
okay. On that point, I should quickly point out, you say Israel still lingers. How familiar are you with the Israeli War of Independence, 1948?
I know. There was the Nakba. They started Zionist militia started expelling Arab villages, and then the neighboring states declared.
First of all, that's I'm going to have to disagree with you there. When you say Zionist militia started expelling Arab immigrants, what really happened was, and I can provide quotes on this if you want, prior to knowing that Israeli independence was going to be declared, Arab leadership started encouraging the Arab population of Palestine to leave the area. They said, basically, when Israel declares its independence, we're going to come in here and kill all the Jews. And then, so leave, get out of the way. We don't want you to get hurt. And then once we've killed all the Jews, you can come right back. I provided in my opening statement, I provided the quote from the leader of the Arab League. Let me read it again. This will be a war of annihilation. It will be a momentous massacre in history that will be talked about like the massacres of the Mongols or the Crusades. So 5 nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, declared war on the Jewish state when it declared its independence. And they stated in no uncertain terms what their goal was. They were going to come in and they were going to kill every Jew that lived in the region. They told, and there's plenty of documentation on this, they told Arabs living in the region, get out of the way, leave. We don't want you to get hurt. We're going to come in and kill all the Jews, and then you can come right back. Well, what happened? They lost the war. Now, I mean, as a libertarian, I'm against war in general, but and regardless of whether or not we can say any particular war is justified, I have to say in this case, losing wars is kind of decisive. You guys started a war in which you said your goal was to kill all Jews in the region, and you lost. A bunch of the Arabs who left at the guidance of Arab leaders saying, get out of the way. We want you to get out of the way so that you're not hurt when we kill all the Jews. Well, sorry to say, they lost the war, but you chose to leave your homes. So when you say Israel still lingers as a colonialist project, I mean, they started a war of annihilation, saying they were going to destroy the Jewish state and all the Jews living there, and they lost. We can argue about whether or not colonization or immigration is justified in any given circumstance, but losing wars is kind of decisive. When you lost a war of annihilation, I kind of feel like it's very difficult for anyone to argue we're justified in our continued opposition to a group of people we tried to utterly annihilate and lost that war.
Okay, so I guess I'll address 2 points on that. Is the kill all Jews perspective, and also like, might makes right. And from like a modern morality lens, like I think most people agree might does not make right. So obviously they won and they take it, right? Like, but that's the whole point. That's the reason people are protesting now. Is that we supposedly live in a democracy, and it's supposedly the people's voice. So if the people are going out in the streets and protesting to saying, hey, this is wrong, then we should stop. So we're saying, no, might doesn't make right. The right makes right. And that's what people are arguing about. So
would you deny a person's right to defend themselves if someone else came in and said...
Yeah. So let me address that. The kill all Jews part, right? Obviously, we already addressed the point of like how Jews were, did live under relative peace, and I don't want to get back onto that topic. But the thing is, when they say kill all Jews, right? There's actually a weird translation of like what they mean when they say kill all Jews in Arabic. So, for example, the Houthi slogan, it was death to America, death to Israel, comma, a curse upon the Jews, which just means like Israel and America is a curse upon the Jews. And another proof is if you look at the updated Hamas charter of 2017, it says, and I know Hamas is not relevant to 1948, I will get to that, but it says Hamas reaffirms that the conflict isn't necessarily just about Jews because of their religion, but with the Zionist settler colonialists, but it is the Zionists who keep conflating Judaism with Zionism. Now, are there Arabs who like say kill all Jews and things like that? Yeah. On that note, I could say, Corey Jill Schuster is like this guy who goes around filming videos. We can see that there's just as much of a sentiment of kill all Arabs, kill all Gazans in Israel. So this notion of this genocidal intent is kind of on both sides. However,
well, I would say I would point this out. If you incite violence against Arabs in Israel, you will be arrested and go to jail. I can already provide documented cases where citizens of Israel have been sent to jail for inciting violence against Arabs.
Okay, then that's a good thing. But on back to 1948, right? Like if in your homeland there's like a blue alien species comes over, they start immigrating with the help of one of the strongest armies, aka the British, and you have the U.S. and all that, and the United Nations declaring 55% of your land to 30% of the invaders or immigrants without your consent coming in. If they gave 55% to the new 30% who came in immigrated without your people's consent, you would kind of be mad, and you would kind of want to fight back, and you would say, and then what would happen amongst the people's populist mentality is kill all blue alien people. It's just something people would say, right? It's not that they mean like all blue alien people are bad. It's like,
well, again, yes, but we're talking for them, they are only willing to accept Jewish existence as second-class citizens under Islamic law, and that's exactly what the Arab League and the other Arab nations said at the time. Now, as to the point of you're still using these statements like came in and stole land. That's not what happened. The Jews immigrated legally, and by the way, the British were extremely what's the word I'm looking for? The British sought to appease the Arabs rather stringently. They put strict immigration requirements on Jews. Let's see, let me find a quote for you here. The British response to Jewish immigration set a precedent of appeasing the Arabs, which was followed for the duration of the mandate. The British restricted Jewish immigration while allowing Arabs to enter the country freely. Apparently, London did not feel that a flood of Arab immigrants would affect the country's absorptive capacity. During World War I, the Jewish population in Palestine declined because of war, famine, disease, and expulsion by the Turks. In 1915, approximately 83,000 Jews lived in Palestine among 590,000 Muslim and Christian Arabs. According to the 1922 census, the Jewish population was 83,000 and the Arab population was 643,000. Thus, the Arab population grew exponentially while that of the Jews stagnated. Even under British rule, it's not like Jews were just flooding in and being helped to do so by the British. The British were, in fact, putting strict limit. There were way more Jews that wanted to come than were being let in, and the British were stopping them from coming. Meanwhile, they did absolutely nothing to stop hundreds of thousands of Arab immigrants from coming in. Immigrants, mind you, that again are no more recent to the area than the Jews. As I've already pointed out, it's not like Jews came in guns blazing, kicking people off the land. They purchased the land. And as a libertarian, I reject the idea that land can be exclusively owned by an ethnicity. Land can only be owned by individuals. So as to the British mandate, the British mandate originally contained all of what is today Israel and the country that is now Jordan. The British cut it in half, said, okay, we'll give all of Jordan, about 80% of the land, to the Arabs and 20%, what is now Israel, to the Jews. The Arabs are like, no, that's not good enough. The Peel Commission finally comes up with, okay, we'll give like 20% of what's now Israel to the Jews and the remaining 80% to the Arabs. No, that's not good enough. I mean, the British, granted, the British were playing both sides of the table. They were making promises to both sides they knew they couldn't possibly live up to. But they appeased the Arabs over and over again. They offered the Jews, had the Arabs simply accepted the partition that the Peel Commission offered, the Jews would have ended up with 20% of what today is Israel, and that's like the size of New Jersey. Plus, they'd have gotten all the rest of Israel and all of Jordan. Yet that wasn't good enough. The Arabs repeatedly made clear, we will not tolerate a Jewish size of any size, no matter how small. Why? Well, again, comes back to religion. They were not willing to accept independent Jewish rule. It had to be Jews subjugated to an Islamic government.
Okay, so on that note, I do agree that from one of the Jews' perspective that are coming from Europe, for them it wasn't like land theft because they were not the ones that were going in with guns and taking. In their perspective, they took their savings and they bought land. So it is not really the culpability doesn't fall on the individual Jew that was immigrating from Europe. However, the culpability does fall upon the British, and I'll explain why. These land transfers weren't exactly fully consented. The Palestinian, okay, I know you're gonna say that's not a nationality, and I'll get to that. The Arab poor farmers that were there, they did not receive any compensation for the land. There's a lot of middlemen who took the land, who did some registry modifications in the Ottoman Empire registry and in the British registry, land registry, when they held that, when it was under the British government rule in the British mandate. They're the ones who received the compensation. The Palestinian farmers didn't receive the compensation. So from the Palestinians' perspective, he's like, these people came in, took our land. Now, from the Jews' perspective, we simply bought the land. And this is kind of, who are the real evil people? It is the middlemen. It's the British and the Ottoman Empire who literally sold the land. There were absentee landlords. There was fake records that they made. And the majority of the poor Arab farmers did not receive any compensation. The middlemen, the greedy people, they're the ones who did the modifications. They're the ones who took in all the money from the Jews and stole the land from the Palestinians and gave it to them. So on that note...
Okay, well, no, here we have to... The argument is, well, who was the rightful owners of the land? Because the British and the Ottomans would argue that those poor Arab farmers were illegally living on land that they owned and had a right to sell. Now, I'm not... And it's difficult to have a conversation in a broad sense. You'd have to look at the specific cases in every case. Now, am I going to argue that there were no Arab farmers that got screwed in this process? No, I'm absolutely certain there are. Just like I know there are Jews that got screwed with not being allowed into Palestine despite they'd paid their fare and were trying to escape. A lot of people got screwed over by large people groups like the British, the Ottomans, etc. in this process. But that doesn't prove, yet again, underlying this is this idea that all that land rightfully belonged to the Arabs, and the British and the Ottomans had no right to sell it. I don't believe you can just make a broad blanket statement like that. Right. All of them had their fingers in the pot to a degree. Now, is it possible some got screwed over? Yes. But if those Arab farmers were illegally living on land that actually was owned by someone else, it's not necessarily unjust that they were kicked off. Again, I can't say that broadly. I can't say that was the case in every circumstance, but I certainly can't say that in every circumstance the land sales to Jews were illegitimate either.
Yeah. So, from an American perspective, we both are like strong private property proponents, and there's a lot of land in the U.S. and you can drive around and say, this is my land. I'm not going to pay taxes. I don't need a landlord. But, if you look at the context there, right? These farmers were basically like, they were living there for generations, but they never owned the land. They never had the paper. Some feudal, some lord technically had the paperwork who owned all the land. All these farmers, they basically gave up a lot of the crops they grew just to stay on the land, like perpetual rent, but they never had the paperwork. Now, this goes back to touching on the morality of private property. Like, I believe, like, if you work the land, you've lived the land, you own the land. Like, that's usufructism, I believe. It's like, and there's even anarcho-usufructism, if I understand that concept right. Like, private property rights aren't as inherently like who has a piece of paper, because that piece of paper can come from the state. I believe that like private land is dictated by like, were you the person who has like the connection to the land? You were the one living there, you grew up there, you used the land, you built on the land, then that is your land. So yeah, it's not the fault of the Jews entirely, it's not the fault of the Palestinians, it's the fault of the greedy people in the middle, both the British and the Ottomans, who screwed them over. And as a result, I am going to say, like, were they illegally living there? Probably, but I think they were justly living there. Legality and morality aren't necessarily the same. Legality is whatever the state says. So the Arab farmers could have been illegally living there, but they were rightfully living there, in my opinion. And they were screwed. And at this point, obviously, like I said, I don't blame the Jews or the Zionists in this case, but the Zionists, there was a Jewish colonization trust, if I remember that name. It was this really rich, rich donors were donating to it in Europe, and they basically sent like huge sums of money to basically buy land in Palestine. So like really rich people. So from the poor Palestinian farmers' perspective, it's like these rich people at the top are like doing some shenanigans, and then I'm getting kicked off my land. So rightfully so, they would feel like, I gotta resist. I gotta fight back. And there were a lot of peaceful protests too, and there was a lot of violence too. And obviously there was violence on both sides. Arabs hit the Jews hit the Arabs. But one morality, like you can kind of see one is different from the other, right? When the Arabs attack the Jews, or the Arabs attack the Zionists, for them they're attacking someone who's perceived to be an invader of their land. They're attacking someone who's perceived to just come in, give money to someone at the top and take their land, right?
Okay, and again, at absolute best, that would apply to the poor farmers who were already in British Mandate Palestine. Hundreds of thousands of those Arabs, when the riots really started breaking out, had just themselves immigrated there to take advantage of the economic opportunities that had been created by Jews. Again, I'm not denying, were there some Arab farmers that probably got screwed over in the early stages of this process? Yes, there probably were. But that hardly justifies the huge backlash, that came to encompass Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, the war of extermination to protect these Arabs who, again, many of which had just literally immigrated to the land no more recently than the Jews. And I would like to say, you say people who live on the land, who work the land, in a sense, you find that more legitimate than any level of paperwork or any claims that my ancestors lived on this land, right?
Wait. Yeah, so I agree that like if you work the land, you live the land, your ancestors live in it, it's kind of your land. That weighs more than paperwork because government.
Okay, well, I would just ask you this question then. It's been almost 80 years since 1948. The vast majority of Arabs who actually lived on the land have since passed away. The people who today call themselves Palestinians are the oldest generation is the children of those people, but now the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, or even great-great-grandchildren of the people who lived there prior to 1948. None of those people have actually lived on the land that is now Israel, and the people who do live on the land and have purchased it are Israelis. So by that same logic, today, wouldn't it be the case that Palestinians arguing that every inch of Israel should be theirs are in fact making the same argument that was supposedly illegitimate for the Zionists to make back in the early 1920s?
So in general, I think the right of return that like the UN still holds and a lot of Palestinian holds is a bit ridiculous because it has been 70 years. But to be fair, there are some really old people who like actually grew up in before 1948 and that are still alive. So if they technically have a right to that land, yeah, kind of.
There are some, but again, they're not going to be alive for much longer. In a good 20 years' time, there's going to be no one left from this period.
True, and it obviously it would be stupid to argue like, they should just mass migrate back. Like that's not gonna work out where the Israelis gonna go. Right now, what we're talking about though is like, what is the reason for Palestinian resistance? Right, like from 1948 to today, is it just Islam? But so we already talked about like, in 1948, for them it was fighting off potential invaders who were slowly taking their land, even though the Jews didn't intentionally take their land. For them, it was like that, so they were fighting back. Nowadays, after 1948...
It was an element. I don't think you can ignore the copious amounts of quotations from Arab leaders at the time calling on the people to resist specifically for Islamic reasons. Bear in mind that I didn't read the whole quote for the sake of time, but there is an important passage in the Hadith. It's part of the Hamas Charter, and it's frequently quoted by the Palestinian Authority in internal communications to its people. There is a belief among Muslims that the end of the world will not come until the Muslims fight and kill the Jews. It's actually a rather a rather gruesome passage about how the rocks and the trees will literally cry out and tell the Muslims where to find the Jews. But I mean that was even going back to the early 1920s. You can find the imams and the Arab leaders inciting the people on that very basis. So to claim it was all about land, it is, I think, disingenuous. But also, I would add this: if this is purely about people like the Jews stealing the land that rightly belonged to the Palestinians, why do you think then, from 1948 to 1967, the Gaza Strip was occupied by Egypt? That was sovereign Egyptian territory, and per the statements of all, to include the Saudi Arabians, the Egyptians treated the Gazans extremely terribly. The West Bank was sovereign Jordanian territory. From 1948 to 1967, not one peep out of the Palestinians about this illegal occupation of their land by Jordan and by Egypt. Why do you think that was?
Okay, I think you addressed a lot of other points that I wanted to touch on first. So I'll get to the question about Egypt and Jordan occupying the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But in terms of religion, right? For me as an atheist, I always see religion as a tool by the people in power to motivate the masses to do something that benefits their riches and power. So, for example, I kind of believe that Israel is a extension of the U.S. They need a military outpost. They needed a place for the Jews to go. They didn't want to take in the Jews, the U.S. after the Holocaust, etc. So, as a result, you have Christian Zionists in the U.S. who would also say similar things. The similar prophecies, like you mentioned for the Islamic ones. Christian Zionists also believe, and again, I might be wrong, but this is what I've heard, is that like if the state of Israel is created and all the Jews move there, then it will trigger like a second rapture that helps Jesus Christ come back or something. So as a result,
not exactly that, but it's along those lines, yes.
Along those lines, right? So we can see that the people like in power, pastors, imams, or whatever, they use religion to motivate the people towards doing something, a movement, to get support for a movement, which is really about power and money in the end. But they use religious scripture to motivate their people to do what they want. So it's the same logic when you quote like imams or Arab leaders. Those societies are very religious. And how do you get your people to motivate them to like die for your cause? Like, how do you get them to really fight, like really strong? Religion is a strong motivator, right? People were ready to die for God. We know the Crusades and all that. So to motivate your people, you wanna make it so like they're fighting for something eternal. And the way you do that is to say you're fighting for God. The way you do that is by quoting scripture or misquoting scripture and by saying some stupid revelation or whatever. And both sides are doing that, from Christian Zionists to Christian Zionists and pastors to imams and the Quran accordingly. So that's why I don't really like when someone quotes like this imam and just said this and this imam said this. Yeah, they say radical things all the time. I think that's just a way to motivate their groups to do something.
But
like inshallah,
so you're saying the people don't really believe that. That's just what the leaders are saying.
it's possible a lot of the people believe that, but I think beyond that, for the people, money and raising their kids and having a stable life is still more important. When you talk to a lot of these Hamas members and interview them, they say, I don't want to do this. I just don't have a normal, stable life. I wanted to be a decoder. I went to school for computer science, and then my mom was killed. And like, I just couldn't do it, and then the power was cut off. Like a lot of people, it's not like, and then the religious part comes in, and then they feel, I'm gonna fight for Allah, right? It's not just a 0 to 100. I'm fighting for Allah just to kill Jews for no reason. It's like, I went through trauma. It's because of these people, and then what motivates, and then you have imams using that trauma to come in and say, why don't you fight for Allah or be a martyr? And then they go out and do terrorist activities or whatever. But it's not like skip the trauma part. And you can go from 0 to 100. You just want to kill Jews, right? Like of course, there's evil Muslim people who are using that trauma to get their will, right? But the core cause of it is still Israeli occupation, Israeli ethnic cleansing, and after October 7th, I would also argue genocide, attempted genocide as well. So it's really the trauma.
Well, there's a lot we can get into there, and we're running low on time quickly. But sure, I mean, I respect that that's your opinion. But and I'd love to continue this conversation later, but I am running low on time. Sure. I would just quickly like you to ask again, if it is truly your belief that this is not primarily about religion, but about Israel occupying land that rightfully belongs to the Palestinians, what is your answer to then? Why, from 1948 to 1967, was there no public outcry about Egyptian and Jordanian occupation? I mean, if this really is just about it's land that rightfully belongs to Palestinians and no one else has claim to it, why did they not seem to care at all about this Egyptian and Jordanian occupation? But the moment Israel gains control of the lands after the Six-Day War, suddenly this is all historic Palestinian territory.
Well, I mean, I would disagree that there was no public outcry. There was a lot, but it's kind of common sense. You would
I can say the Palestinian Liberation Organization did not identify either land as historic in its declaration in 1963 with Yasser Arafat as the head. When they founded their organization and stated their goal of destroying Israel, they did not claim the Gaza Strip or the West Bank as being historic Palestinian territory.
So in terms of like Palestinian cause never had a nationality. Nationalities are made up, right? Like nationality senses come and go all the time. It's okay for a group of people to sometimes associate with a nationality cause and not. Also, a lot of the Palestinians viewed Egyptian control as temporary, they still wanted a Palestinian state, but they saw Egyptian control as still better than Israeli occupation. And obviously, for common sense reason, they feel like they're Muslim, we're Muslim, so why not? But they did view it as temporary, unlike Israel's occupation, which kind of feels like European colonization. And I'll tell you one example of India, right? Like, it's very similar. Indian politicians are corrupt beyond repair. Everyone knows this. But Indians still prefer to have them being controlled by other Indians than the British, because it's easy to relate, it's easy to protest, it's easy to kind of like understand their motives, your motives, same culture. So it's kind of common sense. Like, why is there was outcry, there were protests around it. If there was particular bad, human rights violations, etc., there were protests, I'm pretty sure. But obviously, it was a lot less because it was viewed as temporary. Palestinian statehood was still on the line, and also they were also Muslim, they were also Arab, and they had a lot more in common. And a lot of colonization, in Africa, there's corrupt countries and corrupt politicians, but they still prefer to be under African rulers other than European rulers, because it seems it's worse when it's like someone from 10,000 miles away is controlling you and taxing you. But when someone close to you is taxing you and controlling you, it's a bit easier to like just protest and fight back and things like that. So that's just what I believe. I haven't read it, but you're right. I actually didn't do much research on Egyptian or Jordanian control, and the media seems to not talk about that much, and I don't know why. But for me, it's
Okay.
common sense.
Well,
Yeah, they were Muslims and Arabs. That's why they didn't protest too much, I guess.
okay. Well, quickly. Well, I think that's. I mean, I'm going to say I think that's more or less an admission that this really is a religious conflict. Because if they're fine being ruled by Muslim Arabs, so long as they're not Israeli, then that shows that really is what this conflict is about. Now, I'm running low on time. I would love to continue this conversation later. May have a part two if it were. I want to read one more quote. That'll be my closing statement, and then I'll let you close us out.
Sure.
But this is a quote from Zahir Hussein, PLO Executive Committee member. That's the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and he said this in a 1977 interview. The Palestinian people do not exist. The creation of a Palestinian state is only a means for continuing our struggle against the state of Israel for Arab unity. In reality, today, there is no difference between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. Only for political and tactical reasons do we speak today about the existence of a Palestinian people, since Arab national interests demand that we posit the existence of a distinct Palestinian people to oppose Zionism. For tactical reasons, Jordan, which is a sovereign state with defined borders, cannot raise claims to Haifa and Jaffa, while as a Palestinian, I can undoubtedly demand Haifa, Jaffa, Beersheba, and Jerusalem. However, the moment we reclaim our right to all of Palestine, we will not wait even a minute to unite Palestine and Jordan. End quote. Again, that's a leader on the Palestinian Liberation Organization. I can't say he represents all the Palestinian people, but I think there's more than enough documentation to show. At the end of the day, this is, for the Palestinians, this is not about an independent Palestinian state. This is about there being no Jewish state, and they will continue to engage in warfare, terrorism, whatever it takes to destroy the Jewish state, which is why I think any talk of a two-state solution or peace negotiations are futile. Ultimately, the Arabs are not interested in anything but destruction of the Jewish state in the area, and if not outright genocide of all Jews, at whatever Jews remain would be second-class citizens under Islamic law. Therefore, I cannot claim that Israel is the opposition to peace here. They have come to the peace table numerous times. The Palestinians have repeatedly rejected any offers for an independent state, and I believe there's more than enough quotations that can be provided showing that the reason is because it's not about, they are not interested in peace. They are interested in the destruction of the Jewish people in Israel. And that is where I will end.
Okay. I'll give my closing statement as well. And you're right. I think we could do a part two later because there's still a lot we haven't touched about, especially after 48 or the current conflict. But overall, from a secular atheist perspective, you just simply look at it as a political person and you say, look, you have the Jewish population being 15% in 1900s. You have the Ottoman Empire falling to the British. And then you have the British Mandate for Palestine saying, we're going to make a homeland for the Jews. You have a lot of Zionist leaders saying, we're going to colonize Palestine. We need to make a Jewish majority nation there. We have founders of Israel saying, we need to expel the Arabs. And I know we talked about the context there, but basically we have intent, right? We have intent from the very beginning that they want to create a homeland for the Jews. They want the Jews to be the majority. And then in 48, we see a lot of expulsions of Arab villages. And then after that, after the 6-Day War, you have Israel, which Israel started actually. And I know you're going to say the mobilization of Egypt or whatever. And we can discuss that in part two. But after Israel initiated it, took the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, you have a blockade of the Gaza Strip. You have settlements in the West Bank, which they just go in and steal land and people taken out. Military checkpoints, really strict border crossings, no sovereign citizenship. You have, and then if you go back to the blockade on Gaza, right, like they cannot leave without a permit. Less than 2% of permits are approved. There's just a lot of non-religious reasons that any reasonable person would want to fight back. And whether you agree with their tactics or not, the majority of a lot of the world, I'm not going to say majority, a lot of the world sympathizes with the Palestinian cause because it feels just like European colonization in many aspects. It feels like a remembrance of the European colonization that they themselves felt. And as a result, even if you take some radical scriptures and we discussed in this live stream, scriptures from the Quran aren't really that relevant because you can get similar bad faith script, quotes from the Bible, the Talmud, or whatever. So as an atheist, I don't really take that to heart. if you're going to quote imams or Arab leaders saying that, well, as I mentioned before, people in power use religion to their advantage, and I'm sure people aren't just like joining Hamas or whatever just for religion. They go through trauma first, and then they are used by corrupt Arab leaders to then make them join Hamas or whatever militant group. So it's not from 0 to 100 they want to kill Jews. There's genuine occupation, there's genuine colonialism, and then there's trauma, which then causes them to use religion as their way to motivate them. I'm going to fight for God, and then God is a very strong motivator to fight and get through hardships. So that's why I believe religion is very fundamental to the area. Of course, it's fundamental. Islam is fundamental to them, but if the root of it is still politics, it's still money, it's still about resisting colonization. Religion is just how they cope with it. Religion is just how they motivate themselves. But at the end of the day, people just want to live life. They want to raise their children. They want to go to school. They want to live in a safe environment. And yeah, that's my closing statement. Cool.
Okay, well, no, thank you very much for inviting me on. Like I said, I would love to finish this later. And then I know you said if you would send me the recording, I will post this on my YouTube channel as well to make sure we get max views.
Sure thing. Thank you, my 2 cents. I will send you the. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, you have a good rest of your day.
You too.